Okay, thanks, Fred. If we can turn now to Simon from ODI.
I'm going to stand up if I may. I only wear a jacket because nobody takes me seriously if I don't. And you missed the article in The Guardian which said that people who doodle are more intelligent, I think it said. So I never used to doodle, but now I do, just in case I get caught. I want to start by paying tribute personally to David for the leadership that he's shown on this issue. He was a leader when he was in Nepal. He was a leader when he was the Chief Health Advisor of BFID. He's been a leader on avian flu. But he's also done an extraordinary job of leadership on this, because you can just imagine all the ways in which it could have gone wrong. There are some big beasts in this particular cage, not least in Rome. And David has managed to retain a great deal of goodwill. And the key thing that he's done is not to try to write a master plan, but to provide a coordination opportunity for people. And coordination is a kind of boring word, but it's a really important way to do it. And to avoid trying to turn this into a new long-term initiative institution has been a very important early decision we took, and I think it was exactly the right one, and you've been proved right. So thank you for the work you've done.
So those were nice words. Now the big hit.
No. But you know what? I have barely thought about food issues, which have been a big part of my life and dominated 2008. I've barely thought about food issues since Lehman Brothers crashed. Yeah. Because actually there's an air of unreality about this if we neglect the fact that we are living through the biggest crisis since at least the 1920s, in which certainly policymakers' attention is focused in a completely different place. I've just spent the 2 days, as some of you have, at the first DFID annual conference, which took place in London on Monday and Tuesday. DFID did a great job in getting a food session onto the agenda, but for the whole of the first day, which featured Douglas Alexander, Ed Miliband, Gordon Brown, and a number of other similarly eminent people, the only thing that was mentioned that had to do with the future development was the crisis. Now, of course, it is true that undernutrition is a key early indicator of the impact of the crisis. And there's been a great deal of discussion about the additional numbers that are going to fall into food insecurity, defined in various ways as a result. 50 million is a number that was being cited during the Vilnius conference. And no doubt that's an underestimate. When I did the piece of work with Kofi Annan earlier in the year, based on ODI research, which shows that Africa will lose at least $50 billion this year, that's equivalent to 2 weeks' worth of income for every woman, man and child in Africa, at least. And for people who spend 80% of their income on food, obviously these 2 weeks' income, which is going to drive people into undernutrition, and that has long-term consequences as well as short-term consequences, because the impact of malnutrition is irreversible. So the nutrition story is at the heart of our discussion of the crisis. But what is very important is that it is a kind of part of a much more complicated conversation. And as we talk about the fiscal stimulus, about trade protectionism, about the change to the governance of international organizations, all of which will be on the agenda for the G20 in April, the question we need to ask is, how do we link that conversation to this conversation? Well, one key thing comes out of the debate about the crisis, which is that suddenly we have understood the importance of global coordination. Fiscal stimulus in one country alone does not work. A fiscal stimulus which is coordinated across the G20 does work. Similarly, trade policy in one country will be ineffective, but avoiding protectionism across all countries will be effective. Coordination at global level is another word, really, for multilateralism. And one of the consequences of this crisis will be to give a big boost, I think, to multilateralism. Getting multilateralism right is going to be very much part of the answer, and so not simply putting all the money through the World Bank without reforming the World Bank, making sure that the UN has its part to play. My own view, and I said this yesterday at the conference, is that the UN has been virtually invisible on the crisis. There's been some extraordinary leadership from Bob Zellick at the bank. Josette Sheeran, I think, is probably the best UN leader of her generation at the World Food Programme. But the UN as a body has been absent from the discussion about what should be on the G20 agenda, there is going to be a conference convened by the President of the General Assembly in, I think, June, which will receive the report from Joe Stiglitz' commission, but by then the decisions will have been taken and it will probably be too late. There are some things we're learning about what we have to coordinate, what this new emphasis on multilateralism means. David referred to the new business model of WFP, and I want to just say a word about that, because what it tells us is that the answer to the crisis which causes a food problem is not to retreat into actually what is protectionism that we decry in developed countries, in developing countries. The answer, I think, is not to emphasize national self-sufficiency, large national stocks, disengagement from the market, a retreat into talking only about small farms without thinking also about large farms and about the supply chains which have done so much to reduce poverty in the world. The WFP business model is interesting because Josette Sheeran started by saying, look, we have this model in which we supply food, and we have it from the United States or Europe, and it goes through, gets delivered into the households of poor people and refugee camps and so on. She started at one end of the pipe, which was with local purchase. And she's very proud of the fact, and I think quite rightly, that 80% of the food that WFP uses in Africa is purchased in Africa. They're now starting to think about the other end of the pipe and asking the question, how can the food supply chain engage with local markets in Africa in terms of giving people access to those markets? So they have a pilot program, I think, in Burkina Faso, which is providing vouchers for people so that they can then go and buy food in local shops and stimulate the local economy in that way. In addition to coordination, the other big thing that will come out of the crisis is a new commitment to social protection. There will be proposals agreed at the G20 for a new vulnerability fund in the World Bank. Gordon Brown talked about that in his speech on Monday. There will be a huge investment in protecting people against the impact of shocks in 2009. This will accelerate all the conversation about social protection in the context of the MDGs, but it won't be based on distributing food, it'll be based on distributing cash or access to food through vouchers and other means. A food crisis at the household level has never been about the production and distribution of food. It's been about lack of income and lack of entitlement. And it's really important that as we have the conversation about the food crisis, we don't retreat into a kind of food first position that we know so well from the 1970s and 80s. I'm on the board of the Fair Trade Foundation. Isn't that a fascinating thing? They're concerned about the welfare of poor people. Poor people achieve welfare by growing crops that aren't food, by selling them through markets and through trade, and by selling them in supermarkets, engaging with modern supply chains. The route out of poverty for the small farmers who engage in fair trade is to grow coffee and cotton and sugar and sell it in supermarkets in the UK. Working on food, working on hunger, remember that lesson, because it is about how people escape from poverty. Now, final thing I want to say is this, that this is a highly political conversation. Every single thing anybody says about food is contested. Large farms or small farms, food crops, cash crops, stocks, no stocks, trade, no trade, biofuels, not biofuels, GM, not GM, and all those conflicts and contradictions came out in the discussion during the crisis session of the food session of the DFID conference yesterday. I used to think that there were right and wrong answers, and I still do think I know what the right and wrong answers are. But what I've actually also learned is that because all these questions have winners and losers, and different points of view, in the end they have to be adjudicated through a political process. There is no substitute for a serious, sustained argument about food policy in communities and in countries. In the end, it's not for me to say that cash crops are the answer to food insecurity in Africa. It's for African countries themselves to say. That means that we need to revisit the work that people like Margie Buchanan-Smith did on how food planning happens, how food security units work, how these political processes around food are managed at the country level. The new thing here is what we have to do to have some kind of more coherent food security planning internationally. Because the questions that the crisis has thrown up are about poverty and about how we manage fiscal stimulus, but they're also about the new globalization we need to build in this century. how do we manage to get the benefits of globalization without exposing people to risk? And what are the food consequences of that? Do we need a different way of managing global food stocks, something Steve has written about? Do we need different kinds of finance? Do we need different kinds of coordination of international research? I don't think, do we need to regulate supermarkets in a different way? I don't think we have a global food story which picks up the challenge to globalization which the crisis has thrown at us. And probably that's where the latest research needs to be done. I want to finish by saying that some of the best work on this that I think has been done in the world has been done by Steve Wiggins and his colleagues in ODI, a whole series of briefing papers which have been absolutely cutting edge, have contributed to the UK debate, for example, on biofuels. I want to acknowledge that, Steve, and also thank DFID for the financial support they provided, which has made it possible. We need to stay as ODI and as a London community absolutely at the forefront of this debate, because in the end, we measure development by whether children go hungry or not. I don't agree with David that things have been getting worse. For a generation, things have been getting better, but that progress is at risk and we mustn't let it slip.
Thank you.